that there are a lot of things which are symbolic in nature. If you try to understand them per se, you'll perhaps not be able to gauge the essence and the wisdom behind those things. But if you look at those things as symbolic realities, you'll find that there is a lot of things that can be understood. Let me give you an example. The flag of our country, it's just a piece of cloth, isn't it? But it's not just a piece of cloth. It has a deep symbolic significance. It's like something which unifies us as citizens of a country. We pay a lot of reverence. We feel for that flag. We would not like to fall it to the ground. And of course, there are so many things which are attached to the flag, although it's just a piece of cloth. So you see, it has a symbolic importance. It signifies the unity of a nation. It represents a nation in a small sphere. It reflects our aspirations. In a very similar way, the national anthem that we have, all countries have a national anthem. Now, that national anthem is like, again, a symbolic thing which encompasses the spirit of being together as citizens of a country who vouch and who aspire for the fact that they would like to protect their country from harm, and they would like to do all that is good for its development and betterment. So you see, these are symbolic things. And if you start analyzing these symbolic things in crude ways of logic, you end up mystified because they themselves are nothing. They actually signify a certain reality which is behind them. And the case of animal sacrifice on Eid is no different. It's very similar. It is a symbolic thing. The first thing that you need to understand is that animal sacrifice per se, slaughtering an animal, is not something which in itself is required. There's something else which is behind it that is required. Just as a piece of cloth, our flag is not a piece of cloth. It has something behind that sentiment, which is expressed in that piece of cloth which becomes our flag. And that is that when we slaughter an animal, we actually give this pledge to the Almighty that today we are slaughtering this animal before you and making a vow. And tomorrow, if my own life is needed, my own life is needed to protect my religion, to protect the bloodshed, to protect people who are persecuted in the name of religion, who are put to a lot of test in the name of religion. And if I am required for their defense, I'll be there. So it's basically a vow. It's basically a symbolic representation that today I'm sacrificing this animal, slaughtering it in view of my own life. If tomorrow that is required, I'll not withhold it. So you see, this is the symbolism in animal sacrifice. And if you understand this symbolism, another thing will become very apparent, and that is that it is irreplaceable. It cannot be replaced by charity because you see, people mostly think that animal sacrifice is basically done in order to distribute the meat of that sacrificed animal amongst relatives or amongst those who are needy. This is not the case. Had this been the case, of course, animal sacrifice could have been easily replaced by charity, because at times it is more beneficial to the recipient. Charity per se is meant to help people. It is something which is itself a worship ritual. Animal sacrifice is something which is not primarily done to help people. The meat that is the result of that sacrifice is a byproduct. It can be used by your own self, by your friends, or it can be distributed amongst other people. So if this is gauged properly, you'll be able to understand that animal sacrifice is in itself an independent worship ritual. It represents our vow, our pledge to the Almighty that if ever our own life is needed, just as we are giving this life, this animal before you, and dedicating it to you, and slaughtering it with your permission. Tomorrow, if time comes, we are ready to sacrifice our own lives for a lot of good things, which of course are done for the purpose of protection of religion, for the purpose of protection of people and the life. You can clearly understand that. So if this is understood, you can see that how important a worship ritual animal sacrifice is. But in spite of this importance, you have to understand that it is still an optional worship ritual. And if there is, for example, times like today, they do exist in other times as well, that when perhaps people are dying or they need help or they are really pushed in their lives, then maybe the money that you have saved up for animal sacrifice can even be used for that purpose. But then you have to be clear that you're not replacing animal sacrifice by charity. You're actually spending that money on another cause which became very important during those days. And you must always think that the two rituals, charity and animal sacrifice, they are absolutely independent from one another. Both have their own significance, and therefore they must not be confused with one another. So this is a very important distinction that must be made. And if you don't make this distinction, you end up thinking that perhaps slaughtering an animal is merely for the purpose of distributing meat. It is precisely to this aspect which the Almighty has referred to in the Quran when it says, Lagin yanal alalhumwa wala dimaa, walakin yanal hu taqwa minkum, which means that the blood and the meat of the animal does not teach God. That's not the purpose. Spilling the blood of that animal or consuming the meat of that animal is not the purpose. But the purpose is the taqwa, is the intent that you have in your heart, which is that God, I'm ready to sacrifice my own life whenever the need comes, whenever the time comes. You need to understand that as far as animal sacrifice and Eid is concerned, first, it should be understood that it's an optional worship ritual. It's not mandatory. It is not something which is incumbent upon us. You have to do away with this notion that animal sacrifice on every single or maybe an earning hand of the family is essential, or it is something that he or she is required to do. So the first thing that needs to be dispelled, the first thing that needs to be understood, that however much important it may be, and it is, the worship ritual in itself is left to our discretion. We can undertake it because it has a very, very significant place in our religion. And if we choose not to do it, it's entirely up to us. So the first thing that should be understood is this.